How do you see India playing in this emerging both economic and geopolitical world?
The only thing that can keep India from being the biggest and most powerful economy around 2070 is India. All roads lead to Mumbai and New Delhi a few decades from now.
Ambassador Tong is managing partner at the Asia Group, where he leads work in Japan, China, Korea, and Asia Pacific policy broadly, and provides strategic counsel to multinational corporations navigating the complex policy and market challenges in Asia. A career US diplomat for 3 decades, Kurt has served as the Consul General in Hong Kong and Macau, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Economic and Business Affairs, also the US Ambassador for APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Corporation. A lot of people frame this US-China tech competition and simply ask who's winning. I'd rather ask you, what in this dynamic has surprised you?
Both nations have been taking steps recently that show their weakness rather than their strength. China went through a self-indulgent sort of wolf warrior phase, which is, we are strong, we can do it and get away with it. But is it the smart thing to do? No, it's not. The US now is displaying all of its weaknesses on the global stage to a very excessive extent by allowing our domestic politics to lead to lack of consensus.
The US and Japan also go through in the 1980s a very intense competition. How much of difference do you see between that US-China competition today vis-a-vis that US-Japan competition a few decades ago?
Japan had a period of very rapid growth. Its enormous capability to do engineering made Japan seem bigger than it actually was. China's the continental power, a geopolitical adversary of the United States, whereas Japan was a defeated adversary, then became a treaty ally. So there's a lot of differences. It's quite possible that all of that, people looking back saying that China thing, that was a first half of the 21st century thing. And now we're looking to India, and we're looking to Africa, and we're looking to Europe, or we're looking back to the United States.
Do you think Hong Kong will re-emerge as this economic engine in Asia?
I believe that Hong Kong continues to be the most important financial center for Greater China, and it will retain that for at least another decade, if not longer, in the semiconductor field. In order to maintain technological advantage in that field, you need to be constantly improving in order to stay ahead. It's not sufficient to just be where you are and then hope that others don't catch up, because they will catch up.
Hi, and welcome to today's episode of the Great Tech Game podcast, where we bring you some of the world's best thinkers at the intersection of technology, geopolitics, business, and global affairs. And while the world looks at the US Europe relationship very closely, one of the key relationships that I'm hoping that we get to talk a lot more about today is the US Asia relationship. As the two economic powerhouses in the world today, the relationship between the two is quite complex and quite varied, given the varied amount of kind of nations that make up Asia, and of course the different relationships the US has had with countries in Asia over the last several decades, but especially now in recent years. And to talk about this US Asia relationship and how it's evolving in the current geopolitical churn, in the current geoeconomic churn we're seeing, we have with us today Ambassador Kurt Tong.
Well, thank you, and I'm really looking forward to this.
Kurt, I want to start off with a broad question, right? As I mentioned, of course, on our podcast, we talk about the intersection of tech, geopolitics, and business. In a book I wrote a few years ago, I call the Great Tech Game, this global competition that's where tech is at the center of that competition, but tech is also now a tool, right, for countries that are competing in that game. So I want to ask you a broad question first. From the time you spent in Asia and the time, of course, you've spent in the US as a career diplomat, representing the US as well, how are you seeing this, what I've called the great tech game, but really this tech driven competition evolving in recent years?
Well, I think that you're definitely onto something in the sense that technology friction and the competition for supremacy in technology has become one of the really most important ways that nation states exert themselves in the international sphere. And so there are lots of nation states are naturally competitive. They seek optimal outcomes for their citizens as well as for their national power. And the target of that competition, if you will, and it can be cooperation, but but primarily competitive mindset can shift over time, and so whereas in past centuries the main issue was who had control over land and water in an agricultural economies, it later became who had control uh, over goods manufacturing in a goods manufacturing centered economy. And then gradually over the last decades, I think it's been shifting towards who has control over or preeminence in the generation of information, digital economic strength, and then the technologies that underpin that. And so I see this as a long term trend that has naturally made um, nations much more focused on the uh, on core technologies and their ability to access them and exploit them than they have even in the past when those technologies that they were concerned with were most directly related to military capabilities. Now it's a broader definition of technological dominance.
Yeah, and as you look at the US China relationship in particular, right, in that context of the great tech game,
Yep.
where do you see the key elements of that competition, let's say? Like, are there certain technology layers that you believe are the more important aspects of that competition between the US and this rising challenger that it faces in China?
Well, I think that it's quite clear that the governments are focused very heavily on uh, the future AI capabilities, artificial intelligence, and its various expressions, both military and non-military, um, as a key element of competitive capability, economic competition, as well as geopolitical and military competition. But then AI being essentially a bunch of electrons and numbers is difficult to control and difficult to maintain dominance, and also difficult to assess who's really ahead. And so the focal point of technology competition has been the hardware that produces or underpins the software that produces the AI capabilities. And so we see this rather sharp focus over the last decade on semiconductors in particular, but computing capability in general as the main focus of technological competition and also technology denial efforts by the United States in the areas where it considers itself dominant. And that's different from uh, decades past, where it was more about steel, say, or other materials, or also the very heavy emphasis for decades on denial of nuclear material being the key to competitive positioning. And so it's really remarkable to me as someone who's been doing this for decades now, um, or interested in it for decades, how much uh, really almost singular focus there is on computing capability as the be all and end all of national competition.
And I must ask, do you think that that's the right priority? Do you think that the focus is overly on it and maybe at the risk of ignoring other elements?
I'm a bit conflicted, actually, because I think that if you were to list the priorities of national competitive capability, computing capability would certainly rise to the top. I'm quite skeptical about the ability to deny computing capability to capable countries over the long run, or even over the medium term, because it's such a leaky technology. It's difficult to get your hands around, and a lot of it is highly transferable in the form of human capital. So, uh, trying to maintain a long term, and this is what people in the semiconductor field talk about quite a bit, is that in order to maintain an advantage in technological advantage in that field, you need to be constantly improving in order to stay ahead. It's not sufficient to just be where you are and and then hope that others don't catch up, because they will catch up. And there are nations that have discovered that, um, and are now reckoning with the consequences of that. Where I go to Japan quite a bit for my work with the Asia Group, and the um, the degree to which Japanese feel like they kind of lost sight of the ball by concentrating on manufacture of certain consumer items and certain inputs to the broader semiconductor stack and computing process, and now they no longer have dominance in any of the key aspects of that stack, other than to a certain degree in semiconductor manufacturing equipment, and they feel very vulnerable as a result.
Of course, countries, take these bets either, consciously, subconsciously, private sector driven or otherwise. And it's only in hindsight that one, as you're talking about Japan, it's only in hindsight that you see, okay, maybe the dynamics evolved in a way, or industries evolved in a way, or technologies evolved in a way that their earlier focus maybe didn't turn out to be the right one, right? In hindsight.
Yeah, and I think that it may very well turn out that the current sort of maniacal focus on who's ahead in large language model definitions of what artificial intelligence is turned out to have missed the ball. And there's something else that happens technologically that then leads to that being considered a technology of the past. Entirely possible. And I wouldn't rule out any number of leading countries being very, very capable of being part of that advanced technology game. As a former diplomat, I mean, my the other aspect of my mixed feelings of this is that at the end of the day, um, global peace and prosperity is managed and preserved through human interaction and conflict avoidance, and that delicate balance of assurance and deterrence that keeps the peace. And even as nations try and influence one another and seek advantage, both economic and political, and sometimes trying to change the systems of other countries. So that 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 human aspect of maintaining stability and prosperity, I worry that in the pursuit of a short-term advantage technologically, people can sometimes lose sight of the fact that short-term advantage is only going to be a short-term advantage, and that it's the long-term positioning, the alliances and geopolitical positioning that's actually the more important underpinning of peace and security and prosperity.
Yeah, yeah. A lot of people tend to sometimes frame the study of this US China tech competition and simply ask who's leading,
Right.
or who's winning, or who's likely to win. I don't want to ask that question at all. I'd rather ask you, as someone who has spent time now, you spent a lot of time in Hong Kong in recent years, of course, and East Asia more broadly. My question for you is, what in the dynamic between these two countries specifically, and then we can talk about maybe even other Asian countries and their relationship with this tech competition that we're seeing pan out. What in this dynamic has surprised you?
Well, I think that the shift from a sense of underlying competition, but being ready to work together and seek common cause, to a situation where uh, the the effort to seek common cause is seen as a weakness, on both sides is quite striking, and has happened in ways that I didn't really anticipate happening so quickly. And the you sense it coming back in bits and pieces, and things that President Trump says and others say seem to place a value on stability, and laying out the possibility of finding common cause, but the conditionality that both sides are applying to one another in that respect almost preclude the ability to cooperate. And the fact of the matter is, the countries are quite evenly matched. So the U.S. has advantage in a number of areas: technological, higher income, more friends and allies than China has. Uh, but China's large and capable, and has enormous human resources and ability to throw resources at various problems. And that understanding of being evenly matched tends to feed an increased sense of competition as well. And working through that is 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 a real problem. The the There's significant lack of self understanding in both countries, both lack of understanding of their own strengths, and also lack of understanding of their own weaknesses. And the thing that I find quite interesting is that both nations have been um, taking steps recently that show their weakness rather than their strength, and they think they're showing their strength, but they're actually showing their weakness.
What specifically?
So to give some examples on that, I think that I mean it's died down a little bit, but China went through a self-indulgent sort of wolf warrior phase. You've probably heard that term,
Of course.
where uh, China's rise then led to a semi-emotional trumpeting of the fact that China's arrived and is powerful and can throw its weight around, and can do so while sort of thumbing its nose at the rest of the world, which is, an interesting observation by China. Yes, we are strong. We can do it and get away with it. But is it a smart thing to do? No, it's not. It actually alienates people. And then China's first foray into development assistance through the Belt and Road Initiative also turned out to be highly counterproductive in creating more suspicion and anxiety in other countries rather than less, even as China thought that it was assisting these countries. So, by coming up with a combination of really obvious uh, iron fist and kid glove approach to reaching out to the global south, which is the natural set of friends and allies for China, China ended up shooting itself in the foot. Uh, the U.S. now is displaying its own um, internal political incoherence and sense of exaggerated, I would say, sense of economic insecurity, and um, and displaying all of its weaknesses on the global stage to a very excessive extent, by allowing our domestic politics to um, lead to lack of consensus on common sense approaches to problem solving. And the rest of the world observes that. And so rather than, gosh, the United States is a democracy and democracy is good and I want to be part of that, I want to be friends with that country, we are indulging, and I think both political parties are guilty of this in the United States, indulging in full expression of all of our differences and whims, um, to the exclusion of consensus building and common sense policy. The rest of the world's watching that and is like, that's not so great. Um, Still generally prefer, most nations of the world prefer hanging out with U.S. companies and entities. Certainly, that's true in the NGO space and academic space, particularly. But the U.S. has been undermining itself quite a bit of late, and the tariff policy is just the latest and most obvious manifestation of that.
Yeah, I want to move to the impact that, of course, this the U.S.-China relationship and the whims and the internal political incoherence that you talk about, the impact that's having on Asia in a minute. But before we do that, given the amount of time you spent in Japan and how well you know the U.S.-Japan relationship as well, how, if you go back a few decades, the US and Japan also go through in the 1980s a very intense competition, right? Primarily economic, of course, in that case, but intense regardless, right? And that has a lot of ramifications at that time as well, right? For industry, for industrial policy, for companies on both sides. How much of a difference do you see between that US China competition today vis a vis that US Japan competition a few decades ago?
There, thank you for asking that question because it's one of the big themes of the course I teach at Georgetown University. In addition to, it's not a full time thing. The Asia Group's my full time work, but I enjoy talking about this topic. The Japan had a period of very rapid growth, and its enormous capability to do engineering and particularly manufacturing engineering with great efficiency, and combine that with large amounts uh, of financing at reasonable rates, some of it systemically pushed in that direction, led to Japan suddenly rising on the global stage as like the best manufacturing center in the world, and at least in some key sectors. So when I was a baby diplomat, I was involved in conversations about how do we force Japan to create export quotas for things that they don't even make now, semiconductors, satellites, um, in addition to the things which they still make extraordinarily competitively, like automobiles. Um, the That was a moment in time that made Japan seem bigger than it actually was. It is a nation of 120 million people, whose economy then, when other types of competition became more important, Japan did okay, but not great,
Yeah.
and no longer looked world beating. So does that analogy apply to China? Well, there are differences between Japan and China, right? China's bigger by population, has a larger internal market, is less export dependent, um, is a continental power versus a maritime power. It's a theoretical geopolitical adversary of the United States, theoretical and actual at this point. Um, Whereas Japan was a defeated adversary that then became a treaty ally. So there's a lot of differences in both global positioning, inherent capabilities, size, and momentum. But on the other hand, there's similarities: aging population, excessive reliance on manufacturing, that then create overcapacity and threaten other markets, which creates a reaction from those other markets. Um, Slow-footed ability of government to steer in new directions, excessive reliance on state capital, which then stifles innovation, lack of global friends, or a fairly narrow range of global friends, and so some of these weaknesses that Japan ran into are also true in the case of China. My own sense is that there's this whole debate about peak China. Is China peaked or is it not peaked? I mean, how do you define that? I don't know how you define it, but it's an interesting conceptual thing to think about. And my own sense is that it's kind of plateauing, as a global competitor, or a globally dominant nation. One could make the same case about the United States. I'm not sure. We have some advantages. We have immigration. We have freer flowing capital. We've got a superior educational system. There's some reasons to be hopeful about the United States that China doesn't have. And it's quite possible that all of that combined with a shrinking population, which is forecast to drop significantly by the end of the century,
Yeah.
like significantly, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
That could lead to people looking back when my grandchildren are fully operational adults saying, well, that China thing, that was a first half of the 21st century thing, and now we're looking to India, and we're looking to Africa, and we're looking to Europe, or we're looking back to the United States. And I don't know how that's going to turn out, but it's an interesting comparison, and I think it's important to keep in mind the reason why it's important is what is the goal of U.S. and Chinese policy in this environment where perhaps in terms of national power, the lines are intersecting or close enough that the U.S. and China are rightfully focusing on one another as competitors. Well, then how do you manage that competition and
Correct.
have it not both damage prosperity but also damage peace and stability? And that I think, again, getting back to my earlier point, should be the primary focus of policy, not just rising to for on the U.S. side, not just rising to the challenge of China, but then also how do you have this result in the outcomes that you want.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
inevitably that conversation gets back, and I'm sure you have many conversations like this in your podcast, gets back to how does the United States do its own self-strengthening rather than trying to kneecap China.
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. Let me now shift a bit of our gears to the work you do through the Asia Group.
Sure.
Now, of course, we talk a lot about how countries, let's say the US and China, are dealing or managing their relationship. But I want to talk about the impact this has had on businesses, right? And as someone working at the Asia Group, working with businesses that have interests in Asia, of course, there's lots of Asian companies that have deep markets and interests in the US. How are you seeing this entire competition impacting both US companies operating in Asia? What are some interesting pieces you've seen emerge there? And also from the other perspective, with Asian companies, as they've been thinking about how to deal with this new US that they're now faced with.
Yeah. Let me and thank you for reminding me to switch eventually from being professor to consultant here. And the what the Asia Group does is gathers information and makes information in analyzes it, makes it into insights that help businesses figure out what to do about a set of problems or opportunities that they're confronting that are specific to the Asian markets, and often have an interface between the market and government policy in those markets or in the United States. The the U.S. China dynamic that we've been talking about is a prime motivator for policy in the United States, in China, and in the Asian economies that impacts business, not just U.S. business, but Asian business as well. However, and this is a very important however, so I'm going to say it twice. However, the actual policies are much more specific um, and can't just be explained by the U.S. China dynamic in terms of their implication. So, and whether you're talking about tariff policy, technology regulatory policy, other regulatory policies, um, procurement policies, government procurement policies, all of those, there's this underlying sense of anxiety that's driven by the U.S. China competition dynamic that 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 has increased the pace and aggressiveness of policymaking, especially when it relates to what people call economic security. So there's economic security policy being created in digital space, in pharmaceutical space, in defense, in finance, um, related to cryptocurrency, you name it. Every sector, this idea of economic security is a major element that's both increasing the pace of regulatory change and the intensity of it. Um, but those policies that are actually being created sometimes have nothing to do with U.S. China. Like, for example, the fact that there is a debate around how AI should be regulated, and what is the right model for the balance between AI regulation and AI promotion, is making more intense some rather sort of nuts and bolts parochial discussion around very specific things like the access of children to the internet. Right? To my knowledge, neither you know child access to the internet, child safety on the internet is not a debating point between the U.S. and China.
Yeah.
Presidents have never talked about it. No one says that's China's position, that's the U.S. position. But this underlying competitive dynamic that everyone needs to rush and keep up, and that economic security has created more eyeballs on these issues amongst government and other policymakers, and it is and it is somehow driving an increased pace of regulatory change and more action happening faster than it would otherwise be the case. And so understanding that the ways that the US China competitive dynamic does and does not influence those regulatory actions and activities is really important for companies. And then they have to figure out how to sort through the specifics and then figure out what to do about it. And, everyone thinks child safety is a good idea, right? Hope so. Uh, but then how is it done? How is it defined? And et cetera is something that should happen between governments and businesses working together. That having an understanding of the geopolitical dynamic as well as the regulatory specifics is a good thing to have. And that's one
Yeah.
of the things that we try and concentrate on.
Yeah, and as far as opportunities are concerned, right? I mean, there's of course the old Chinese saying about this, that in every challenge and crisis there's an opportunity.
Right.
For clients of yours, let's say American companies looking at Asia, as Asia tries to figure out, Asian countries, governments as well as businesses try to figure out how to develop their own strategy to deal with this new world. What kind of new opportunities do you feel are being created both for American companies as well as Asian companies now? Are you seeing certain sectors where new opportunities are getting created, or certain kind of functions?
Yeah, there are some things like, again, not to obsess about the US China thing, but where the conversation is about how do you maintain the benefit of the relationship between two largest economies, but then also realize the opportunities that are being created by friction therein. So, to give another example, advanced pharmaceutical ingredients um, are considered a area of Chinese dominance. They're just very good at manufacturing because of the strength of the chemical
Yes.
industry. So, especially small molecule um, forms of pharmaceuticals. So, but then there's concern about overdependence on that. So, does that create an opportunity in other Asian countries or in the United States? Yes, it does. Um, how much? Figure That's something you got to figure out. At what pace, and then who makes the decisions of it, and then how can those decisions be influenced? That's a lot of what we do. I think that generally speaking, however, the main growth source of growth and opportunity expansion in throughout Asia, with the exception of places where there is no opportunity like North Korea, is just more smart people working harder and having more access to more information. So across the board, almost every Asian country is successful in promoting education, human resource development, travel, information access, and putting real emphasis on the software of growth, and then therefore succeeding. And so there are relatively more successful and less successful Asian societies, but across the board, they're just doing really well. And and that's because of an underlying sense of you can talk about values like hard work, right? And I'm sure
Yeah,
you've been in conversations where people talk about Asian values and hard work values. It's the same. It's the same thing as just investing in people,
yeah,
um, and that's what these economies are doing successfully.
yeah. How do you see India playing in this emerging both economic and geopolitical world?
It's a game changer. So the only thing that can keep India from being the biggest and most powerful economy around 2070 is India. And that's the kind of the question is, can India sort out its own governance issues? And I'm not talking about like a specific leader or party or any of that kind of stuff. Just the general sense of building, because there's now huge income disparities and development disparities within the country, um, but enormous upside potential for investment in capacity there to be extraordinarily successful, both in goods and services and exports and imports and everything. Um, as long as the conversation can be about growing the pie and not about who gets what slice of it, and India can succeed in that, I expect that like all roads lead to Mumbai and New Delhi a few decades from now.
Yeah,
Our company's quite proud of the fact that we've identified that fact, and it's our largest market for the Asia Group. We got
so
our
it is.
biggest team on the ground is in India, and it's a real growth market for us. It's a difficult environment for doing business, but the upside potential is enormous, and growth of businesses that enter India now are going to be frustrated, right? And they're going to feel like they're on this kind of flat trajectory, and then they're going to wake up 5 6 years from now and realize they've done this hypotenuse, or not hypotenuse, what's it called? I've forgotten my math.
It's like a
The
J
the
curve. Like you,
the
you,
one
you
that, the
might
one that
seem like,
curves up,
but yeah, you're
uh,
setting the foundation, correct? Then,
geometric increase. I forget what that curve thing's called, but that's going to happen,
yeah,
and so companies that persevere through that are going to be extraordinarily successful.
yeah, yeah. Um, Very quickly on trade, I know you spent so much time doing a lot of these trade negotiations that I referred to also when I was introducing you. Do you sense that there's some respite coming to this craziness in trade negotiations? India, for example, you were just talking about India. India was shocked, I think, at the 25% and then 50% tariff piece and the bonhomie that seemed to be there that seemed to have shaken up. Of course, every country has its own story. Do you see this as a temporary thing now, Ambassador Tong? Or do you feel like this is now the new norm? This uncertainty of trade and trade negotiations.
I'm not entirely sure. My gut is that things are going to be difficult. Dealing with the United States, dealing with China has always been difficult. The EU's got its own challenges, but the United States is now the most difficult uh, country to work with in international economic diplomacy right now. I think that's quite clear,
Yeah,
and I don't expect U.S. policy to suddenly go through an inflection point where it becomes predictable, transparent, and consistent. Um, under this administration, my main criticism of this administration is that that lack of transparency and lack of predictability and unclear vision for what the end what the end point is that you're trying to grasp at,
Yeah.
um, is undermines the outcomes more than anything else. Because if the
Yeah.
goal is to onshore manufacturing, including old generation manufacturing, to the United States, all right, that's an understandable goal. Tariffs are a very blunt tool to accomplish that, that create a lot of side effects, unintentional side effects, which are negative. But in the main, it could be accomplished that way. There's better ways of doing it, but in my opinion, but that is one way to do it. However, if you don't know what the tariff's going to be a few years from now because of unpredictability and
Yeah.
non-transparency, then that completely undermines the objective of bringing the manufacturing onshore, and all you're left with is revenue. And tariff revenue is not something that anyone has ever identified as being a an important goal for U.S. Balancing of the budget. And by definition, it is a self-disappearing form of revenue, because the tariffs get high enough, then trade goes down, and then you don't get the revenue.
Okay.
So that basic mathematical error of over reliance on tariffs for
Revenue.
international economic policy is really bad, and I don't know whether it's going to go away, because the Democratic Party, when it was in charge, didn't demonstrate any understanding of the problem either. And so it's quite possible that the US will be the outlier. The question for me is, 5 years from now, uh, is it just the US that has stepped away from WTO principles and the idea that an open market is a good way to attract attention and capital and innovation and growth while protecting people that need to be protected, um, and compensating losers in the trade disruption that takes place? Is the U.S. going to be the outlier in that sense, or is the rest of the world going to start to do it? And I don't know
Yeah.
the answer to that. My
Yeah.
Right now, it looks like it's going to be the U.S. going to be the outlier, and other countries are reacting to the U.S. approach by bonding together and talking more about freer trade amongst themselves than they are, um, about responding to the U.S., which, after all, is only one country, 5% of global population, somewhere at 15-20% of GDP. The rest of the world can do what it wants if it wants to. China is also an outlier in terms of state capital, and so there is a possibility. I don't know the answer to this. I'm dying to see what happens, or will be very interested to see what happens, where the rest of the world bands together
Yeah.
and pushes forward with the globalization project without China and the United States. Don't know. India's going to be a big swing vote on that. Don't know where they're going, but it's a really interesting question.
Yeah, yeah. No, I agree with. I think I agree with that question. I think it's a interesting one and hard to say today. Let me now move to the sections of our podcast where we do briefing for leaders, both political and company CEO leaders. Right. So, if you're advising Kurt, Asian government leaders, policymakers today, what tools would you suggest that they use to deal with, as you were saying, a US that seems to be a really hard country to deal with today?
I think they should do more to find common cause with one another's and attempt to approach the United States as groups. The U.S. will resist that, but that capability, and I'm thinking of ASEAN, but I'm also thinking of other groupings, non-China groupings of like-minded countries approaching the United States. Their outcomes are going to be better. And the EU is demonstrating that already.
Yeah. If you were to advise Asian CEOs of large Asian companies with such unpredictability of tariffs, etc., 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 how would you advise them to even start thinking about, let's say, the next 2, 3, 4 years of their strategy?
They're going to need to have differentiated, market specific business strategies that do not exclude the US, do not exclude Europe because it's slow, the US because it's closed, China because it's problematic. But they need an all of the above business strategy, but those strategies each need to be individually different, which will raise costs for them. But if they try and go at the whole world with just one strategy, they're going to run into problems.
If you're briefing now the US president on the single biggest risk of America's current policy towards Asia, including China, but let's say with China and then the rest of Asia, what would you highlight to the US president?
I think our president should spend a bit more time reflecting on the value of U.S. alliances and friendships, and draw more upon the advice and the willingness to find common cause with like-minded countries, issue by issue, um, and give more time and attention to that rather than pursuing, ideas that seem attractive just because they're iconoclastic. There's nothing wrong with a good idea that's already been discovered being pursued just because it's already been discovered.
Yeah. If you've talked about the intersection, and we've talked about the intersection of tech with economic security, as you talked about, but then also national security. So now, if you were briefing both the White House and the Pentagon, how would you advise that they work together to make sure that the economic and national security goals don't actually come into conflict with each other?
Um, that's a complicated question and difficult to answer in short version, but I think that concentrating on, and I believe this is what they do, especially at the Pentagon. What are the capabilities that we need to provide deterrence? Not deterrence that overly threatens and undermines deterrence by creating a crisis, but effective, long range, long term deterrence. What are those capabilities? Build backwards from those. And in terms of the technological capabilities that are most important, and focus on what we need as the primary goal, and the denying what the other sides, theoretical other sides, need as an important goal, but as a secondary goal.
US versus China, who do you think will win the AI race?
Uh, I'm not sure either is going to win. I think it's going to be a tie.
Who do you see as
My
number
reason
three?
my reason for that is that I think that as soon as one side gets ahead, the other side is going to catch up like a couple days later, and vice versa, over and over again.
Do you see any disruptors? Do you see who's number three and number four for you in that race?
Uh, by nations, I think any number of nations could come up with something that is temporarily really important and disruptive. I'm thinking, for example, of mRNA vaccines. Where'd they come from? Wasn't the idea didn't come from the U.S. The U.S.
Bought it.
put the money into mass manufacture in the pandemic crisis, but the ideas came up from somewhere else. I do think that there's a giant sucking sound, for lack of a better analogy, both in China side and the U.S. side. As soon as there's a good idea that's AI related,
Yeah,
it's going to be just like hoovered up by, on the U.S. side, in particular, big companies.
yeah. Um, in semiconductors, after Taiwan, who's next?
In terms of capability,
Yeah.
I guess it's probably the United States, but there's a little bit of a distance there. And then Korea's right in there swinging, depending on the segment.
Yeah. Um, what's the one thing that, and we've spoken a little bit about this, but I'll still ask the question. What's the one thing the US administration doesn't understand about China that you wish it did?
Uh, it's not that it doesn't understand it, but it doesn't put enough weight on the fact that China's got its own internal problems, and at the end of the day, it is a significantly inward-looking, inward-facing, inwardly obsessed country. And as a result, there's a lot of noise that gets generated that gets interpreted as externally focused when in fact it's designed for an internal audience. I think the same could be said for the United States and other countries. I find that like you know non-Americans will read the newspaper and see exciting political events in the United States that seem really important, and they put too much emphasis on it. And it's really just political theater inside the U.S. and it's all ephemeral, and will probably go away, and not actually impact the interests of other countries or citizens of other nationalities.
Yeah. What's the one thing the US you think is getting wrong about India?
I think the U.S. is insufficiently sensitive to India's political mindset and the historical reasons thereof, and the pride uh, and desire to not be told what to do by other countries is underestimated by American leaders.
Biggest geopolitical risk, according to you, in the next 12 months?
Next 12 months?
Yeah.
Um, well, the most impactful ones will be lack of. I'm worried that there will not be progress in ending the shooting war that Russia started in Ukraine. Would really like to see that source of instability and possible escalation go away. I think that's the most important because, after all, it involves Europe and a nuclear state. Um, and then, the second most important is whether the Middle East situation can calm down. Particularly, uh, I think the fact that the Gaza situation remains largely unresolved is a festering problem that could really undermine the significant progress that's been made in that region by a lot of um, sort of long-term focused, both Arabs and non-Arab people in the Middle East. Their ability to realize their more economic focused dreams can get undermined by a continued emphasis on political conflict.
In a future US China war, God forbid, which domain in emerging tech, cyber, space, or others, do you think will be the most critical one?
Um, well, you mentioned the two that I would have nominated, cyber and space,
And
and
which of them?
they're interconnected, of course, right?
Yeah, of course. This we didn't get a chance to talk about, but still, I want to bring that in as a question. Do you think Hong Kong will re-emerge as a as it used to be, this economic engine in Asia and this dynamic hub?
I believe that Hong Kong continues to be the most important financial center for uh, Greater China, and it will retain that characteristic for at least another decade, if not longer. It is still an important uh, transmission point for business acumen and management ideas. Um, but I think that role will continue to fade over the coming years.
And for an aspiring diplomat, and this is our last one, for an aspiring diplomat, whether US or otherwise, as someone who's been a career diplomat, what's the one region or one theme that you think an aspiring diplomat should be um, aiming to become proficient in today with a long term view?
Well, based on what I said earlier, I think that um, non-Indian diplomats investing in understanding of the Indian subcontinent, not just India but the entire region, is really useful. I think that people that are studying up on Africa are making a good investment in the long run. Um, the in the nearer term, I think uh, uh, this goes not just American diplomats but across the board. One thing that diplomats often lack is an understanding of business and economics, And so anyone aspiring to be a diplomat should, if not do private sector work, spend a lot of time learning about it, because it's just going to become more and more important over time. And ideas are being generated in the private sector much more rapidly than in the public sector. And if one sequesters oneself from that and only focuses on academia and government, you're going to end up missing the picture.
Yeah. No, this has been great. Thank you so much, Kurt, for taking the time to address a wide range of questions I threw at you. We end every podcast with two simple ones. I've asked you lots of complicated questions,
Mhm.
but we end every podcast with a request to tell us, give us a recommendation of a book that you think you'd like to recommend to the listeners who are interested in the kinds of topics we've discussed today, and also a podcast guest that you'd recommend we bring on.
Oh gosh.
Everyone
Uh,
stumbles on these two questions, Kurt, not the more world-shattering ones that we
yeah,
discussed.
these are hard. These are hard. So I'm going to recommend my good friend and colleague, Ambassador Dan Crittenbrink, that you
Okay.
bring him on and have him tell you about more in this. Uh, uh, he was ambassador to Vietnam and a leading U.S. diplomat towards China, and I respect the heck out of him. I think you should bring him on and have him delve further into issues around Southeast Asia and China. The A book I'm reading right now, so I always have trouble with that question. I'm reading a book called The Anarchy, which
Hmm.
is a, a history of an amazingly brutal period in uh, India's history that I knew nothing about, and I'm learning about from this book. And it's focused on the rise and conquest of India by the East India Company.
Yeah. William
And
Dalrymple. Yeah.
yeah, so you probably read it. I think
I've read that book. Yeah.
it's there at the same time. Okay, sorry, I'm giving you a long answer now. Same time, I was reading the second of the trilogy by Rick Atkinson about the U.S. Revolutionary War, and these things happened at the same time.
Yeah.
And the
That's right.
the much larger number of people getting affected and killed in that brutal period of India's history compared to what happened in North America is, to me, quite striking. The
Yeah. Yeah.
scale is just bigger, and it's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I have noticed the similarity in timing of the two revolutions, so to say, and the very different outcomes that happen of those revolutions at that time, and how much that has, in a way, like shaped where India went and where the US went. I think that's a
Yeah.
fascinating thing. I'm glad you've made that same connect.
Okay.
Yeah. No, thanks. This has been fascinating, Kurt. Thank you again for taking the time, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.